Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a massive historical detective story. We are going to take a narrative that has literally dominated our textbooks for over a century, and we're putting it to the test against what modern, multidisciplinary science actually tells us.
So, here's the big question. Did an ancient invasion actually shape Indian civilization? For generations, the assumed answer was just a resounding yes. But today, we're going to impartially examine the source data, and I'm talking everything from satellite hydrology to ancient DNA, to see what the evidence truly reveals. Get ready, because we might just be looking at one of the biggest paradigm shifts in ancient history.
Okay, here's our roadmap. We're going to break down the evidence pillar by pillar, starting with the Aryan invasion theory itself, then the Saraswati River mystery, the archaeological record, the genetic DNA data, and finally, how all of this redraws ancient history. Let's get right into it. Part 1, the Aryan invasion theory and the origins of this long-held historical paradigm. To understand the whole controversy, we first need our baseline. The Aryan invasion theory, or AIT, is a 19th century premise. It basically suggests that around 1500 BCE, nomadic tribes from the Caucasus Mountains invaded northern India. The theory goes that these invaders brought the Sanskrit language, the horse, and essentially imposed their Vedic culture onto the indigenous people of the Indus Valley. But where did this specific date and idea actually come from?
Well, the sources reveal some pretty deeply colonial origins for this theory. Friedrich Max Müller, who was a 19th century German scholar working for the British East India Company, explicitly wrote back in 1866 that his goal was to uproot native traditions, and that 1500 BCE date, he essentially just guessed it based on his adherence to biblical timelines of creation, rather than, any hard science. He actually later admitted his dates were purely hypothetical, but by then, the history books had already run with it.
Which brings us to Part 2, the Saraswati River mystery, and, frankly, a massive chronological impossibility for that 19th century timeline.
This brilliantly illustrates the timeline paradox at the heart of our explainer today. According to modern satellite imagery from NASA and the Indian Space Research Organization, plus extensive geological data, the ancient Saraswati River was this massive waterway that started drying up around 3000 BCE due to tectonic shifts and climate change. By 2000 BCE, it had completely dried up geographically. But remember, the invasion theory claims these outsiders arrived in 1500 BCE and wrote the Rig Veda around 1200 BCE.
Now, why does that matter? Because the ancient texts themselves totally contradict the theory. The Rig Veda mentions the Saraswati River over 60 times, and it describes it not as some dried-up creek, but as a mighty river flowing purely from the mountains to the ocean. So think about it. How could supposed invaders in 1500 BCE write vibrant hymns worshiping a raging river that geological sources confirm had vanished 500 years before they even arrived? They couldn't. The texts describe a geographical reality that only existed thousands of years prior.
With the textual timeline thoroughly challenged, let's look downward. Part 3, Archaeology and the Horse. Let's see what's actually been dug out of the ground. For decades, proponents of the invasion theory would point to skeletons found at the ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro as hardcore proof of an Aryan massacre, a famous claim pushed by archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler. However, the source text points out that modern stratigraphy, which is basically the analysis of different dirt layers, completely refutes this. The skeletons were actually found at entirely different depths, meaning they died at completely different times, sometimes centuries apart. Modern analysis confirms there is literally zero evidence of alien warfare or a violent citywide massacre.
And here's what's super interesting about what we don't find. If a massive invasion came pouring in from Central Asia, you'd expect to find their cultural artifacts left behind in India, right? The source material highlights beautiful artifacts like silver ceremonial axes and golden felines from Central Asian nomadic cultures. Yet absolutely none of these distinct items, seals, or architectural styles ever reached the Vedic regions east of the Indus River. There's just no archaeological footprint of an invading culture.
But what about the horse? This is always presented as the ultimate trump card. The argument goes, the ancient Harappan civilization didn't have horses, therefore the invading Aryans must have brought them. So, did the Harappans actually have horses? Let's look at the archaeological facts.
The evidence says yes, they absolutely did. First off, the Sanskrit word for horse, ashva, pops up frequently on deciphered Indus seals. Second, archaeologists have excavated actual horse bones at multiple Harappan sites. But here is the most fascinating detail from the sources. The Rig Veda specifically describes the sacrificial horse as having exactly 34 ribs. That perfectly matches the native South Asian breed. The Central Asian horse, the one supposedly brought by these invaders, has 36 ribs, so the anatomy itself completely contradicts an outside origin.
All right, moving to part 4, the genetic evidence. Modern biology is now stepping in to build on these archaeological clues by tracking the DNA.
So we can actually trace ancient migrations using specific genetic markers, like the M17 marker. In genetics, a really high diversity in a marker indicates an older population, because the DNA has had a lot more time to branch out and mutate. The data reveals that India has an incredibly high diversity of the M17 marker, making it a very ancient population, while Europe has a much lower diversity. This DNA research tells us that human migration actually flowed from east to west, from India toward Europe, and not the other way around.
To sum up the genetic findings presented in our sources, there has been negligible external gene flow into India since the end of the last ice age. Furthermore, the DNA proves that South and North Indian populations actually belong to the exact same biological gene pool. The scientific data neutrally, but firmly, disproves that whole colonial-era idea of a racial divide between invading Northern Aryans and indigenous Southern Dravidians. Biologically speaking, they are the same indigenous people.
So where does all of this leave us? Part 5, Redrawing Ancient History. It's time to synthesize how these multidisciplinary findings completely reshape our broader understanding of global history.
We can now synthesize all this evidence into a brand new paradigm. Step 1, the decline of the Great Indus Valley Civilization wasn't caused by a violent conquest. It was an ecological event where the drying of the Sarasvati River forced people to migrate eastward. Step 2, the supposedly older Harappan civilization and the Vedic civilization actually existed concurrently. And Step 3, the unbroken archaeological and genetic continuity proves an indigenous origin for the Vedic culture.
The renowned archaeologist B.B. Lal really hit the nail on the head here. He notes, thus the textual and archaeological data combine to establish a perfect spatial-cum-chronological oneness between the Rig-Vedic and Harappan cultures. The sources point directly to the conclusion that the Harappan civilization and the Vedic people are literally just two faces of the exact same ancient indigenous coin.
Which brings us to a highly provocative final thought to leave you with today. We've looked at the hydrology, the ancient texts, the bones, the artifacts, and the DNA. If modern, multidisciplinary science proves that the Aryan invasion theory is really just a 19th century myth, how much of our global history books need to be rewritten today? It's a fascinating reminder to always question the narrative and follow the data. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.